I'm the former chair of the Tarrant County Libertarian Party, and I had this notion to have some cool offices and an auditorium, but it didn't happen until somebody actually put some shoe leather to it and actually made it happen. I did have an office for the LP, which was actually a spare room in back of a cigar bar that you literally had to walk through cigar smoke to get to it. And our auditorium looked very much like a cigar bar. So anyhow, and what I'd like to do is we need to recognize Tarrant County Libertarian Party, run by Liz, and also members of the Tarrant County Libertarian Party EC, if you're, raise your hand. So these are the people responsible for Tarrant County's great success. They're organizing things down to the precinct level. They've got cool spaces like this at their disposal. They've done so many great things. They were recognized by the state LP as the county of the term. So do we have,
here.
This is the award that they got, and literally nobody else could even touch them. This is their award. Very nice. So well done, Tarrant County, EC. Yeah, great job. So to kick off the introduction to Scott Horton, I guess everybody probably remembers September 11th, 2001, and as it was happening, I was thinking to myself, well, apparently we've had war declared on us. This is our Pearl Harbor moment. This is what I was thinking at the time. And I remember actually going to get my daughter, who was in elementary school at the time. She was 10 years old. And just to kind of make sure that, her day didn't go too crazy that day. So now just flashing forward, just to kind of put some perspective on the time frame that we're talking about here, that daughter, who was in elementary school, is now 27 years old and is about to give birth to my first grandson, who my fear is that when he is 18 years old, he will be eligible to go off to war and fight in Afghanistan, and I hope that that's not the case. Scott Horton is here to talk about the fact that we've been there ridiculously way too long. He's got a lot of great information to support that. And the one thing that got me thinking about the length of time involved here, I went back to the book 1984, and there were some quotes in there that I think are as relevant then. It really applies to us today. We're living that. And I'll kind of smash up some quotes that Winston could not definitely remember a time when his country had not been at war, but it was fairly evident that there had been a long interval of peace during his childhood. But since that time of his childhood, war had been literally continuous, though strictly speaking, it had not always been the same war. And again, I think as Scott will tell you, this war has kind of morphed into one thing and another, kind of the same venue in Afghanistan, but it's taken on different faces throughout the years. But the one thing that's constant is that we're always there. So let me introduce Scott Horton to you. Here's some of his bona fides. First of all, can you hear me okay here? Okay.
You can stand here better.
Okay. Oh, I get down like this.
We know you like the mic.
All right. There we go. Much better. So Scott Horton is the managing director of the Libertarian Institute. He's the host of Antiwar Radio for Pacifica 90.7 FM, KPFK in Los Angeles, and 88.3 FM KUCR in Riverside, California. He's the host of The Scott Horton Show, opinion editor of Antiwar.com. Since 2003, he's conducted more than 4,600 interviews with journalists. We are way behind. Politicians, current, former members of the military, foreign policy experts, and others on the topic of U.S. foreign policy and military inventions. He's the go-to guy for all of us libertarians on the issue of U.S. foreign policy, and has often interviewed himself, including recent interviews with Tom Woods on the Tom Woods Show, Dave Smith on of the podcast Part of the Problem, Jason Stapleton on the Jason Stapleton Program, and Jeff Deist on Mises.org, and very recently by Ron Paul on the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Scott resides in Austin with his wife. Investigative reporter Larissa Alexandrova Horton. Was that?
Very close.
Okay, I tried. He's here to talk to us about his book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the broader issue of U.S. foreign policy. Everybody, please welcome Scott Horton.
All right. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I'm pretty loud. Project, they told me don't shout, project. So I'm supposed to start with a joke. Tom Woods said always start with a joke. What's the difference between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump? Right, nothing. The Waco massacre also would have been an acceptable answer. Okay, good. So you like me. We're starting off good. All right, so Ron Paul, of course, is the greatest American hero and is responsible for converting more people to libertarianism than anyone ever. So how many people here found libertarianism because of Ron Paul? Wow, quite a few. Okay, good. And how many had that happen to them right around the Giuliani debate moment in 2007? A few. Okay, 4 or 5? Okay, so everybody remembers that moment. Wow, what a moment. But remember specifically what all was going on there. He didn't just stand up to the bully Giuliani. He stood up to the bully Giuliani to say that America started the war. They didn't start it on September 11th. We've been bombing them for 10 years before September 11th ever happened, which is a pretty bitter pill to swallow. And Ron Paul said that, and everybody, all the pundits and all the people who know everything, dismissed him and said, you know, he basically committed suicide up there. He's going to have to withdraw from the race by tomorrow and all this. And instead, he converted about 20 million people to libertarianism overnight. And why were people so eager to swallow that bitter pill? It was just because it was true and they knew it, and he had enough respect to tell them that. So they said, hey, this is my guy. You know, pretty obvious. And he was right. Okay, so blowback. The term is now, much more prominent in popular culture. You hear it, and it usually just kind of stands in to mean negative consequences. Ralph Wiggum got soap bubbles in his eyes, and he goes, blowback. Right. But the thing is about blowback is it has a more specific and important definition, and that is that it's the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies. So that when those consequences come, the American people, by and large, remain ignorant and susceptible to false explanations of what's going on. In fact, the term was coined, as Ron Paul said in his fight with Giuliani, by the CIA back in 1953 when they had overthrown the government of Iran, the leader Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader Mossadegh, and reinstalled the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, as the dictator there. And the CIA predicted what they call blowback. These long-term consequences are going to come due. Well, and they did 26 years later in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And virtually entirely missing from the narrative about the taking of the hostages and the revolution and the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini was that this was the consequences of what America had done 26 years before. I think one reporter asked Jimmy Carter about it, and he said, oh, that's ancient history. But just think if the Iranians had overthrown George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton 25 years ago, would we be over that by now? Living under a foreign-sponsored dictatorship? It wouldn't seem like ancient history. The 1990s doesn't seem like ancient history to me at all, right?
No.
I'm getting old, but I try to insist I'm not, and that's part of it. Okay, but the thing is, the American people really didn't understand. And so they were left susceptible to the idea that, well, basically, they hate us. They burn our flag, they say we're the great Satan, they chant death to America, what else do you need to know? And of course, there was a lot left that people needed to know. And so, in fact, just one little tidbit here. The CIA and the State Department told Jimmy Carter, go ahead and let the Ayatollah come to power. Because the Shah's sick with cancer, his government's falling apart anyway, And we like the Ayatollah Khomeini. We know him. He helped us overthrow Mossadegh back in 1953. And so we're pretty sure we can work with him. And so they didn't really object to the Iranian Revolution when it happened. But then Jimmy Carter let the Shah into the United States for medical treatment. And that's what caused the riots and the seizing of the hostages at the embassy and all of the bad public relations. When we look back, this all happened on one day, but that's not actually how it took place at all. So, anyway, interesting little footnote there. But 1979 then is the start of everything for American policy in the Middle East, because the Iranian Revolution means we've lost our massive Persian ally that dominated the Persian Gulf there, and so they needed a new policy, and they announced the Carter Doctrine, which said that the Persian Gulf is an American lake, and that any other power on earth, we mean you, the Soviet Union, but really anybody else, attempting to dominate this region or intervene in this region will treat it as an attack on the United States, and upped the American alliance with Saudi Arabia that Franklin Roosevelt had forged after World War II by another few notches. Okay, and then as part of that also, Jimmy Carter gave the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran. Now, well, I don't want to get too far into that, but anyway, so that launched the Iran-Iraq War. And Jimmy Carter also signed a finding on July the 3rd, 1979, that authorized the beginning of support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan who were fighting against the communist government there. And they did this for the specific purpose of baiting the Soviet Union into overexpansion. And they said so. Now we will give them their own Vietnam. Now Vietnam by then meant a horrible, stupid, no-win quagmire that you should have never got into in the first place, that breaks the bank and disrupts and divides society. And they said, well, if the American people, as a result of our Vietnam, don't have the energy and the spirit to contain communism anymore, well, maybe we can turn that lesson around. And maybe instead of containing communism, we can lure them into the same kind of overexpansion and disaster that we just suffered through ourselves. It was Walter Slocum in, I think, '78 who coined the phrase, give them their own Vietnam. And then Zbigniew Brzezinski as well. 6 months after the covert support began, the Soviet Union did invade. And Jimmy Carter sent, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, sent a memo to Jimmy Carter saying, now we will give them their own Vietnam and lure them into this war. Now, I should point out that it's not altogether clear, I think it's actually pretty doubtful, that American support to the Mujahideen at that point actually is what provoked the Soviet intervention. In fact, the Soviet communist dictator, the puppet dictator in Kabul, was so out of control, killing and torturing people and fomenting civil war, that it was undermining Russia's own interests there. And when the KGB, when they invaded, the KGB took the guy out back and shot him and replaced him immediately. So it's not really that the Americans succeeded in luring the Soviets, and it's as simple as that, but same difference, because the point is that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to apply the negative lesson of the Vietnam War for America to the Soviet Union to break its bank and break its back, which of course worked, certainly according to the Reaganites and to the Mujahideen. And part of the Afghan war was not just support to the Afghan Mujahideen rebels, but also to what were called the Arab Afghans. And they weren't all Arabs. There were Muslims came from around the world, really, to go and help fight against the Soviets there, but especially from Saudi Arabia, Libya, Syria, etc. And this is the group that ended up becoming Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda. I like to say it better that way. Anyway. There's this great investigative reporter. He covered the Afghan war in the 1980s. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Eric Margulies. He wrote War at the Top of the World and American Rush. Really great stuff. And in 1986, Margulies met with a guy named Abdul Azam, who was Bill Clinton's mentor and the original, basically the organizer of the Arab Afghans fighting in Afghanistan. And Azam told Eric Margulies, as soon as we're done with the Soviet Empire, the American Empire is next. And Margulies was shocked. Now Margulies, a little bit about his background, he was, to this day, is a self-described Ike Eisenhower Republican, Army veteran, proud New Yorker, the way we're proud of being Texans, the New Yorkers are proud of being New Yorkers. Very patriotic guy, and absolutely, even though he was a reporter, he really, was on the side of the Mujahideen against the communists in this thing. And he was just confounded and said to Azam, or he at least thought to himself, he had never heard anyone but a pro-Soviet communist call America an empire. And he said to Azam, what are you talking about? We're here helping you fight against the godless communist Soviets. You call us an empire? And Azam said, well, just look at what's going on in the Persian Gulf right now. You're sailing your ships up and down, you got bases, you're building more and more all the time, you're intervening in Iraq, and then of course supporting Israel in their occupation of Jerusalem and the rest of Palestine. And so, business is business, so we're coming for you as soon as this is over, no hard feelings, right? Kind of thing. And Marley basically took it to heart and began to understand that he's really right, that even though, we're not the Soviets, it's still how we feel people are building military bases, combat forces on our land, even if they had somehow bribed our presidents or governors into letting them do it. All right, so, make sure I don't miss too much here. At the end of the Reagan years, the Iran-Iraq war ends, and I'll skip this part, but there's a fight over war debts, more or less, and Iraq, with basically a flashing yellow light from the USA, invades Kuwait. They were supposed to really only take the northern oil fields, but they decided to take the whole country, and then that was a problem. So George Bush the First used this as an excuse to expand America's military footprint over there in order to wage Iraq War I, which everybody said was a quick, easy, simple war, and we won it, USA and yellow ribbons, and it all worked out, and it was really great. And forced Iraq out of Kuwait in just a matter of weeks. But then at the end of the war, George Bush Sr. put out a message over Voice of America that said to the Shia and to the Kurds of Iraq to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. The implication being that the Americans who occupied the southern part of the country at the time would help them and protect them. And so they took Bush Sr. up on it, and they started marching on Baghdad. But then, someone in the White House had second thoughts, and they figured out that actually, as soon as they saw Iranian militias and Iranian-backed Iraqi militias coming across the border from Iran into southern Iraq, they realized they were reversing the Ronald Reagan policy of supporting Saddam Hussein's war to contain the Iranian Shiite revolution. And they were now importing it into Iraq. And so they choked. It was probably Brent Scowcroft. So we have to call this off. And so they did. And then they let Saddam Hussein keep his tanks and attack helicopters, some of them anyway, and he put down this insurrection brutally and killed hundreds of thousands of Shia and Kurds. Well, that then became the excuse for America to stay. They had promised the king of Saudi Arabia, as soon as they were done kicking Iraq out of Kuwait, the whole thing would be over, we'll be out of here. But now they had to stay in order to launch these no-fly zones in the name of protecting the Shia of the south and the Kurds of the north from Saddam, who had already succeeded in putting down the insurrection. It was really unnecessary by that point, more of a PR stunt than anything, but then it became permanent. A permanent mission of American air supremacy over Iraq for the entire 1990s in combination with the inspections regime, even though they knew by the end of 95 that every last bit of the weapons of mass destruction had been destroyed by 1991. They kept up the pretense of the hunt for weapons of mass destruction, and they kept up the sanctions on Iraq. The UN report at the time, this is somewhat disputed, so I guess to be fair and cite the low-end study, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 Iraqi children died who otherwise would not have because of the sanctions. And when confronted about this on 60 Minutes, Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, said, "We feel like the price is worth it." And worth it for the stated goal of making the Iraqi civilian population so hungry and desperate that they would then risk everything to rise up again and overthrow Saddam, even though we just gave them that chance and stabbed them in the back when they had it, and even though, of course, the hungrier they are and the sicker they are, the less powerful they are in relation to the central state, which is, of course, still in the money. And so it was absolutely nonsensical policy. That's why it lasted throughout the entire 1990s. At no point during the Bill Clinton years were the Iraqi people ever about to rise up and overthrow Saddam because of these sanctions. And yet that was the excuse for keeping them. And this was absolutely considered an outrage, and particularly by Osama bin Laden. And these were the reasons that bin Laden cited. He didn't cite freedom. He didn't cite, certainly freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, nor did he cite American licentiousness, Hollywood morality and this kind of thing. What he attacked was American combat forces stationed in Saudi Arabia that were being used to bomb and blockade Iraq. American support for Israel and their domination of the Palestinians, and at that time, their occupation of southern Lebanon. Support for all the military dictators of the region, other than Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and the Ayatollah. Every other king and emir and sultan and el presidente in the region is on the payroll of America. Especially Mubarak at that time in Egypt and King Fahd in Saudi Arabia. Pressure on those dictators to keep the price of oil fixed, artificially low, to subsidize the American people's economy at the expense of the well-being of the people of the Middle East. And then, as bin Laden put it, turning a blind eye to American support turning a blind eye to Russian, Chinese, Uzbeki, and Indian atrocities against Muslims, when the Americans claim that they're the biggest supporters of human rights everywhere. They say nothing when it's Muslims who are the victims. And what's ironic about that is that maybe America doesn't say too much, but during the Bill Clinton years, the government continued to support these mujahideen, some of these veterans of the Afghan war, many of whom were already part of this al-Qaeda movement that was attacking the United States. And still, Bill Clinton supported them in Bosnia, which is where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed earned his stripes as a legit al-Qaeda fighter there, supported them in Chechnya against the Russians, and supported them and their allies in the Kosovo Liberation Army in the Kosovo War of 1999. And in fact, the Democrats, Bill Clinton and two different Democrat congressmen, have on the record said after September 11 that, what is the matter with those Muslims? Don't they know that we just supported them in their wars? And he meant specifically, these groups, the bin Ladenites, in their wars in these countries. They're so ungrateful, they attack us anyway. But of course, the other 6 reasons, or the other 5 reasons, I guess, hadn't changed. America was still supporting those dictators and bombing Iraq and supporting Israel and all these things. So Bill Clinton had supported these groups, but had failed to buy them off. And so they attacked us, and they attacked us all through the 1990s, the first World Trade Center bombing. There were a few botched bombings, a Yemen hotel in 1992. Then there was the Saudi National Guard attack in 1995, where Americans are training Saudi National Guardsmen. The next year, in 1996, they attacked the Khobar Towers, which was barracks of American airmen in Saudi Arabia, which the Clinton government, for political reasons, decided to blame on, get this, Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah, who did it, instead of focusing on, and think of that target, especially knowing what we know about al-Qaeda and their motivation for this whole thing, the importance of the symbolism of an attack on a barracks of American airmen stationed in Saudi, right? And instead they go, oh no, it was the Iranians from across the Gulf did it, just because it was some target of opportunity for some nonsensical reason. So not only did the guilty go free and the al-Qaeda guys weren't blamed for the attack that they did, but the lesson about why they were attacking us and what their point was completely lost in this political spin. And then of course there's the African embassy bombings in 1998 and the USS Cole in 1999. There are a couple more failed attacks in there. But the point being that, well, I don't want to skip too far ahead. Let me check my notes and make sure. Yeah, exactly. The point being, they were trying to provoke the United States of America. Okay, after September 11th, of course, George Bush famously said they hate us because we're free. The more innocent and virtuous we are, the more, attached to our destruction these evildoers become. So all we can do is face them on their battlefield and fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here. But in fact, on the very first appearance on Meet the Press, on September 16th, 2001, Dick Cheney said to Tim Russert, well, bin Laden's goal, obviously, is they're trying to force us out of that part of the world. Well, I mean, you might have noticed that this part of the world is this part of the world. In fact, it's the new world. It's the place where, with some exceptions, but for the most part, our ancestors came to be free of the troubles of the old world. So why exactly is America the dominant force in the Middle East anyway, Dick Cheney? Tim Russert didn't ask. But the thing is that, so he was right about the motive there, but he was wrong about the strategy. And this is something that all the neocon hawks said. I'm sure you guys all remember that. They're trying to get us to run away. They're trying to scare us away. They're trying to get us to back down. Well, we're the American eagle. We're USA. We're number one, and nobody can push us around. And so the lesson is then we must always double down no matter what and never leave anywhere and never let them push us around. But in fact, they really were trying to provoke us into invading over there. So, the strategy was, again, to replicate, in bin Laden's own words, to replicate their success with our help in the night, with the CIA's help, that ain't us, with America's government's help in the 1980s against the Soviet Union, against us, and to bleed us to bankruptcy. And this was also a way to unite the various Al-Qaeda factions who had their own troubles in their own home countries, and this was something that they could agree on, that if we can get rid of the Americans, only then will we actually have a chance at overthrowing the king of Saudi Arabia, overthrowing the dictatorship in Egypt, and having things our way. As long as the Americans can come and bomb our caliphate, there's no point in creating one. So first we need to play a really long game here, bog them down, bleed them dry, force them all the way out the way we did the Soviet Union, and then only then can we wage our local revolutions. So that was why they were attacking the United States, was in order to provoke the United States into invading. And again, when it comes to blowback, what we're talking about is the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies that the American people know nothing about. And if you think back to that image, you all have it in your mind, I know you do, of the plane, the second plane hitting the tower that day, it literally came out of the clear blue sky, just like in the cliche. And so people are looking at that with a big question mark on the end. What is this? Why did this happen? John was talking about a Pearl Harbor attack. Well, it was actually almost exactly equivalent, right? 3,500, 3,000 people died, right? Except that there was an Imperial Japan behind the Pearl Harbor attack. There was an Imperial Navy. There were 400 Al-Qaeda guys on September 11th. They didn't have zeros. They had to hijack our planes to even have a weapon to crash into our targets. And so Bush and the American, mostly right-wing media, but really the entire media, just went on to try to spread this confusion, to try to stop you from discriminating about who's who and who did what and what, and to kind of combine terms together and to leave it vague about exactly who the enemy is, because they had a much larger agenda. Okay, so, well, you know I'm going to read this because I think you'll like it. Don't worry, I'm not going to quote myself. I'm quoting somebody else out of my book. Wouldn't that be funny if I sat here and read just...
I'd like it.
The audiobook is now on sale, so... It's like, hey, you know what, I'm going to drink some Dr. Pepper too, as long as we're joking around. Okay. So, this is 2010. Osama bin Laden is still alive, hiding in Pakistan. And his son, he has a few sons, but this one is not a terrorist. And he gave an interview to Rolling Stone magazine at a nightclub in Damascus, Syria. And what he said was this. He said, "My father's dream was to bring the Americans to Afghanistan. He would do the same thing that he did to the Russians. I was surprised the Americans took the bait. I so much respected the mentality of President Clinton. He is the one who was smart. When my father attacked his places, He sent a few cruise missiles to my father's training camp. He didn't get my father, but after all the war in Afghanistan, they still don't have my father. They have spent hundreds of billions. Better for America to keep that money for its economy. In Clinton's time, America was very, very smart, not like a bull that runs after the red scarf. I was in Afghanistan when Bush was elected. My father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and spend money and break the country. I'm sure my father wanted Senator McCain more than Obama in 2008. McCain has the same mentality as Bush. Now, obviously, this is a naive view of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, but I think the point is still pretty clear here of why that makes perfect sense, right? Contrary to what the Republicans would have us believe. When bin Laden saw this pretend tough guy, George W. Bush, right, this kind of faux macho strutting guy who's never really been in a fist fight in his life, he saw this is the perfect mark. And of course, with all his corporate ties and whatever, this is exactly the guy who will take cynical advantage of a crisis. And so I'm gonna give him a crisis. This is exactly what we're gonna do, is give this guy something to exploit. And so that doesn't mean that Bush was innocent and fooled, right? That means that he exactly was the cynical, corrupt, corporate bully that bin Laden perceived him to be. And that's why he was so useful in the enemy's plot. And, Michael Scheuer, one more thing. Michael Scheuer, he's the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit. And, he highlighted parts of bin Laden's speeches where he talked about his overall goals for the region. And of course, they were to bog America down in Afghanistan and bleed us to bankruptcy and force us out, but to also radicalize populations around the Middle East in reaction to what America had done, destabilize the American puppet dictatorships, and then eventually overthrow those governments and create their caliphate. As Michael Scheuer put it, because the American government was being dishonest with the American people about how we got into this mess and what the problem was and what needed to be done about it, they were serving as what he called bin Laden's indispensable ally. And that this group of 400 men hiding in exile out on the far end of the planet Earth from anywhere, who were absolutely helpless to impose their will on anyone, were getting exactly what they wanted achieved, and they were getting the American people and the American government to do it for them, and giving ourselves our own Vietnam again, in the exact same place where you would think we would know better, where we had deliberately attempted and succeeded in inflicting it on another power just a generation before. All right, so that's part one. All right. Now, here's the thing. After September 11th, I say that we didn't have to bomb anybody at all. The USA didn't have to bomb anybody at all. I know people were really mad, but the fact of the matter is that terrorism is a crime. It's right there in the penal code. It's in the statutes. And what happens is if you commit acts of terrorism, then you go to prison for it. And instead, the Bush government decided to treat this as an act of war and exploit it to the ends of the earth as much as they possibly could, of course, as they were meant to. But they could have negotiated, and the Taliban were willing to negotiate the handover of al-Qaeda. Back then, especially, I think maybe people understand a little bit better now, but back then especially, I'm sure you remember how hard the media worked to conflate these two groups together, where the Americans would say to each other at the kitchen table about how the Taliban had attacked us on September 11th, because the Taliban is al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda is the Taliban, when that's really just absolutely not the case at all. The Taliban government were the religious authorities that Bill Clinton had helped the Saudis and Pakistanis install in power in Afghanistan in the 1980s to basically clean up the mess and marginalize the corrupt warlord Mujahideen, who were the ones that the CIA had backed in the 1980s. And they're Pashtuns from the south and east of the country, and the religious authorities, and they had come to take over, and they had taken the capital city of Kabul in 1996, and yet they still had not taken control of the entire country. And this is, basically a militia in a very backwards third world state trying to create a fledgling state. And they have these Saudi and Egyptian radicals who are trying to pick a fight with the superpower. That is, just like as you could imagine, the Taliban hated Al-Qaeda. They were stuck with Al-Qaeda. And in fact, in the summer right before September 11th in 2001, Arnaud de Bourgrave from UPI, the Washington Times, went and interviewed Mullah Omar. And Mullah Omar said, "Bin Laden is like a chicken bone stuck in my throat. I can neither swallow him nor spit him out." And Milton Bearden, who had helped run the CIA war in the 1980s, had said that the Taliban had been trying to signal to us since 1998, since the embassy bombings, that they wanted to get rid of this guy. And they would say things like, "We can't find him right now. He must be out hunting, lost somewhere, which means he's outside of our protection. Go ahead and get him." But then they wouldn't. The Americans would not do it. In fact, Scheuer complained that he and the CIA gave Bill Clinton 10 different chances to kill Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan in the 1990s, and he wouldn't take them. One Senate report said the number was 13. And when I asked Scheuer about that, he said, "There might be 3 I didn't know about, but I wouldn't doubt it." And in fact, here's a footnote. On September the 10th, Bill Clinton was in Australia and gave a speech to some bankers, I guess. And in that speech, it was in the newspaper the next day, he said that his biggest regret, and I believe this, that he really meant this, that his biggest regret of his presidency was that he let bin Laden live and that he never got bin Laden. But then his excuse was, "I had one chance, but I would have had to carpet bomb a little town called Kandahar and kill all these people. And so we decided that it just wasn't worth it." Well, the thing about that is that bin Laden lived at a place called the Tarrant farm that was out on the outskirts of Kandahar, which is not a small town, it's a big city. And the idea that you would have had to send in B-52s and wipe Kandahar city off the face of the earth in order to hit bin Laden at Tarrant farm, which may have killed as many as, single-digit women and children, which wouldn't be okay necessarily, I'm not saying that, but still don't lie to me and say you would have had to commit a massive war crime just to get one man, when it's just a fake excuse. And then the next day, they hit the towers. But it sounds like Bill Clinton talked to me anyway. But the Taliban offered to negotiate. And they said to George Bush, "Look, we'll turn bin Laden over to the Organization of Islamic Conference," which is basically it's like the Organization of American States, right? Only for Muslim countries. It's 56 Muslim countries. And they said, "We'll turn him over to any of these countries as long as you provide some evidence that bin Laden did it. Not enough to convict him in court, but just give us some evidence that he did it." And Bush said, "I said no negotiations." And I should say here now, again, when he says any Muslim country, that means Egypt or Saudi or Malaysia or Indonesia or any country, any of these countries, America's choice, who would have extradited him to Virginia or New York City without a moment's delay, right? So it's basically the slightest face-saving fig leaf for handing him directly over to the United States. And Bush said, "I said no negotiations, no negotiations." So they said, "Okay, well look, we'll give him to the Pakistanis. Give us some evidence he did it." And Colin Powell went on TV and said, "We're preparing a white paper and we're going to give them some evidence and then they're going to see if we can get him there." And then apparently it was the dictator of Pakistan, Musharraf, who scotched that one. I don't know if the Americans asked him to scotch it or not, but he refused to go along with that one. And then once the bombs started falling in early October of 2001, the Taliban said, "We'll give up bin Laden to any third country on earth, and without seeing any evidence of his guilt. You can have it." So that could have theoretically been England or France or Mexico or Canada, probably not Israel, but virtually any other country in the world. And Bush said, "Too little, too late, the bombs have started falling, that's it, Taliban regime's gotta go." Now you might say, "I don't care, man, because honestly I'm so mad about September 11th, or I was then, that a trial's too good for you, and if you're anywhere near bin Laden, too bad, we're dropping bombs on you, and that's tough." And I can say that I don't agree with that, but I can sympathize. Okay? But even if you think that, we still didn't have to have a war against the Taliban. And by taking the war to the Taliban, they actually ended up just wasting about 6 weeks, fighting in the far north and northwest of the country, taking Mazar-e-Sharif and these other towns near the Uzbekistan border in the support of a former Soviet-backed, now CIA-backed warlord named General Rashid Dostum. But meanwhile, the whole time, bin Laden's getting away. And the core group of al-Qaeda fighters are getting away, headed east to Pakistan. And finally, the CIA and the Special Operations Forces, the Delta Force, it's the CIA paramilitaries are called the Special Activities Division, but they're basically Special Operations Forces. And then along with the Delta Force and some bribed militias, supposedly bribed militias, went and found him and cornered bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, his right-hand man, and the rest of the core group of al-Qaeda guys at a place called Tora Bora. And I will concede that they dropped a lot of bombs, including a daisy cutter bomb, which is a 15,000-pound bomb, and they killed a lot of al-Qaeda guys and fellow travelers there at Tora Bora. And yet, the whole time, the CIA and the Delta Force were reporting back to their headquarters and back to Washington, D.C., that they needed Rangers, and they needed Green Berets, and they needed Marines. And Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Tommy Franks, General Tommy Franks at Central Command, outright refused for weeks to give these men the backup that they requested, all of which were available. In fact, our current Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis, was in charge of 4,000 Marines just miles away and was forbidden to come and provide reinforcements. Instead, they were left to rely on these local Afghan militias. The Army Rangers already had seized the Bagram Air Base and had thousands of men stationed there, and the Green Berets were, again, up in the north with General Dostum chasing the Taliban around Mazar-e-Sharif, when they could have been in Tora Bora sealing that border and preventing the escape of the last of the al-Qaeda fighters there, including bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, who finally did escape on December the 17th. So not only was it really not, quote, fair or justified to take the fight to the Taliban, it was actually a huge waste of time and resources, and it ended up abetting the al-Qaeda guys' escape. And now I'm sure you've all heard this a million times. I know we all have heard this a million times. As soon as Osama bin Laden and his friends slipped across the border into Pakistan, well, that was just it. And it's like an old movie where the sheriff is chasing the bank robber, but he gets to the state line, so he has to come to a screeching halt and stomp on his hat and just say, oh, there they go. You know, they jump to hyperspace, and that's it. And yet, no, really, they're right there on the other side of the line. They're just right there. And Pakistan was a friendly country. And in fact, they'd already been threatened because they did support the Taliban. We knew that because we helped them support the Taliban. So the Bush government, Dick Armitage, who worked for Colin Powell at the State Department, had told the Pakistanis, you're going to cooperate with our war in every way or we're going to bomb you back to the Stone Age. And they said, okay, whatever you guys say. And in the book 88 Days to Kandahar by the CIA Islamabad Station Chief Robert Grenier, he says he already had worked out a deal with the Pakistani Army and Frontier Corps to prevent friendly fire if Americans did come across the border chasing these guys. We have a system of communication set up to make sure that our guys don't get caught in the crossfire. We're going to do this. And in all their memoirs, they all complain that they begged for these reinforcements and never got them. The CIA guys and the Delta Force guys. One of the Delta Force guys did a special on 60 Minutes where he talked about they had all these plans and they had air power. So they were going to take helicopters over the mountains and then into Pakistan and then come over from the east to the west and attack the al-Qaeda guys from that way and corner them. They were going to drop all these landmines into the valley. There were only 2 or 3 different valleys that they could have chosen as their escape route. They were going to mine them. They were going to do this. They were going to do that. And they were completely forbidden from making the slightest bit of effort to follow the al-Qaeda forces into Pakistan. And I think that, and their thinnest excuse is, well, you know, we didn't want to stir up some local tribal fighters. Well, why the hell not? I mean, if they're in between you and your quarry on this hunt, then that's their problem. You can ask them nicely to step aside, but if it comes down to it, that still doesn't cause a problem with the Pakistani government, which had given the Americans carte blanche. So the fact that the Dick Cheney government is saying, well, we really didn't want to take the risk of stirring up a few Pakistani tribesmen at the border, to me is a real indication that that's simply an excuse. That in fact they deliberately made the decision to let bin Laden escape. And you mentioned the book 1984 and the Permanent War. A big part of that is the traitor, the leader of the enemy, Emmanuel Goldstein, who must always be on the run and always demonized and always remain a target of the party. And that's exactly what we got out of Osama bin Laden. And it's clear, and I show all this in my book with footnotes and everything, that the Bush administration, they were going to Iraq no matter what, and many of the leaders of it wanted to go on to Syria and Iran and even North Korea as soon as possible, and they were going full bore on this thing, and they were going to take any advantage, make any excuse. And so they needed bin Laden to still be loose. Because if bin Laden was dead, the American people, by and large, would have seen that as the end of the war. Okay, you got him. Wanted dead or alive, that's what you get for messing with us. Home by Christmas, congratulations, boys, we did it. And that was not the impression the Bush government was trying to give. And in fact, I have the full quote in my book, and you can find the video. It's a lot of people are mad. They've seen this video, and they're mad about it, but they still don't realize this clip is from March of 2002. It's only 6 months after September 11th. And a reporter asks Bush, you talk all about Saddam Hussein all the time, but what about Osama bin Laden? Do you know where he is? Is the hunt still on? What's the deal anyway? And, you know, Bush and his government have clearly talked about this at length. He's not exactly sure how to say it to her, so he basically insults her intelligence and says, listen, you know, anybody who thinks that this is about the hunt for one man just goes to show that you don't understand what the fight against terror is really all about, and this and that. And he goes into it, and he ends up basically painting himself into a corner where he says twice, and he even says, I will repeat myself, I am truly not that concerned about him. As long as he's on the run, as long as he's marginalized, then that's good enough. And the deal was, because Saddam hadn't attacked us, they needed to make you be afraid that somehow Saddam could give his chemical weapons to Osama, and Osama was going to use them on you. And they had to keep that going. I believe that's why they let him escape. I can't really prove that, but it sure seems like a pretty certain case that they deliberately decided to let bin Laden go in order to have that enemy. All right, now, you might say, as far as the attack on the Taliban goes, that, you know what, maybe it's too bad if that did divert from attacking Osama, but I still think if the Taliban let al-Qaeda live in their country and have a base in their country for 6 years, then I still say, well, we should still bomb them anyway, because I'm that mad. People are pretty mad. So, okay, even if you think that they had to just bomb Taliban foot soldiers out of revenge or whatever in a punitive strike, they still didn't have to change the regime and install a new government in power in Kabul and then make enemies out of all of its enemies. Because now they've taken this cakewalk war against 400 men that could have been over and done within a matter of a few weeks, and they've turned it into this massive quagmire in a fight that they cannot win. So, I don't have the map, unfortunately, but there's not much to the map of Afghanistan. It's basically a big oval leaning toward the northeast there, if you want to think of it like that.
I can picture it in my mind.
Has Pakistan to the east and to the south in kind of a backwards capital L shape there. And so what you need to know about, there's a few things you need to know about the Afghanistan itself here. First of all, there is no majority ethnic population, but the single largest plurality are the Pashtuns. And this is where the Taliban come from the populations in the east and the south. And they are 40% solid older estimates had them as much as 60%, but apparently the consensus now is they're about 40%. And then in the north of the country, primarily, and the west, though the west is more sparsely populated, I guess, but in the north, you have these other minorities are primarily the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks. And the American mission, to oversimplify it a little bit, but it's true enough to count, the American mission, since they decided to replace the Taliban government with this new coalition government and install it in power there, has been an attempt to foist this coalition of the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks onto the Pashtun population, who obviously, as we can see, have refused to accept it and have been able to resist it. So now it's true that the first dictator, well, president that the Americans installed there, I guess it wasn't the dictator or much, the first president the Americans installed there, Hamid Karzai, he was a Pashtun and the son of a prominent tribal leader from the Kandahar province in the south. And at various times there have been different numbers of Pashtuns who have had power as governors or in the parliament, etc. And yet this does not amount to representation by the Pashtun people in the government in any sense of popular sovereignty. All it means is that they have worse warlords closer to home. And so one example of this is Karzai's good friend, a guy named Shirzai, who was the governor of Kandahar province and then the governor of Nangarhar province, who is simply a child rapist and a heroin dealer and a murderer and a torturer and a warlord and a criminal. And the people of Kandahar and Nangarhar always absolutely hated this guy. They were stuck with him. He was foisted on them. So the fact that he was a Pashtun was no consolation. If anything, it just meant that he had more of an ability to exploit and abuse them rather than giving them any kind of representation in the government there. That's a huge part of what has driven the, people into the ranks of the insurgency all along. The other thing you should know is that Afghanistan is the size of Texas. And we're here in Texas, so you guys know this, but YouTube, maybe you guys don't know, I'll go ahead and say, because this really impressed me when I figured this out. From Austin, where I live, in the relatively, basically speaking, the center of Texas, from Austin to El Paso is halfway to the Pacific Ocean. From just the center of Texas to its western edge is halfway to the Pacific Ocean. That's how big Texas is, okay? Well, that's how big Afghanistan is. And it's landlocked. As I said, Pakistan separates them from the sea. They have mountains like Colorado, deserts like California. It's absolutely inhospitable terrain. And part of being landlocked away by Iran in the west and Pakistan in the south and the east means that the U.S. has to bribe the Pakistanis to let them truck supplies from the port of Karachi. There's a huge mountain range really right there on the border. So they have to go from the port of Karachi all the way up into northern Pakistan, about halfway up Pakistan, to get through the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan to get the supplies into the country for the American troops this whole time. And in order to do so, they have to pay taxes, bribes, protection money directly to the Taliban to the tune of tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars that the Americans pay the Taliban enemy as protection money just to ship their supplies across the country. In some cases, literally you have a Taliban truck in front and a Taliban truck in the back, and American Army supplies in the middle as the convoy with the Taliban protecting them. And you wouldn't believe me, but I can prove it, it's in the book. The son of the defense minister owned a company that was like a Blackwater mercenary force that hired these Taliban guys to provide protection for the Americans. And he even opened up a lobbying firm on K Street in Washington, D.C. to lobby to prolong the Afghan war and his profits. The war on terrorism in a microcosm right there for you. All right, now, so what a great segue into Pakistan. All right, so Pakistanis are our friends, but they support our enemies in Afghanistan. The Afghan Taliban are the primary enemy, as so-called anyway, of the leaders of the Pashtun insurgency against the American-backed government there. And so you might wonder why. And we'll get to the drone war in Pakistan in a minute. But so why would the Pakistanis support the Taliban against America's interests when we're fighting this war against the Taliban there? Well, the answer is the Pakistanis' strategic enemy is India, to their southeast. And they have a perpetual fight over the region of Kashmir, which really wants to be independent, but the Pakistanis and the Indians both lay claim to it. The Indians actually occupy it, and they've had 4 wars since independence in 1979. They're both armed with nuclear weapons, and tensions get pretty high there. There was actually just a report about a time when the Indians almost did this airstrike it was a training mission. And they almost hit their own old defunct base on the border, and then somebody said, you know what, don't. And then it turned out that actually at that house was a major meeting it was on the Pakistani side of the line, and it was major generals and all these important people were meeting there, and the Indians had almost just started a war, on an accidental training exercise. So these very high tensions there. And in the event of a nuclear war with India, the Pakistanis' strategic depth plan is that they need to be able to retreat into Afghanistan. Well, if the Americans succeed in creating this government that they've put in power in Kabul, then that ruins the Pakistanis' plans, because the Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek coalition government the Americans are putting in power there is close to the Indians. So the Pakistanis have an interest in preventing that group from ever having a true monopoly state in Afghanistan. And so they're not trying to put the Taliban in power in Kabul, but they certainly have this major incentive to keep them in play in Afghanistan to keep the situation fluid, just in case for one day. And so the Americans then turn around and ask the Indians for help in backing the government in Kabul. And in fact, we have all these sanctions on Russia for no good reason. So they go to the Indians and they say, hey, India, would you buy a bunch of helicopters from the Russians and give them to the Kabul government for us so we could get around our own sanctions? Thanks. And will you help us train the Afghan army, which is mostly made up of Tajiks? And so in doing so, they motivate Pakistani support for the Taliban even more. So America is asking help from one ally to fight an insurgency that is backed by another ally, which is only doing so because we're asking these guys for help to support these guys in the first place. And it goes around and around like this for now 16 years. Well, what's funny is if you go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and foreign policy graybeard, he just died a few months ago, I guess a year ago or something. But if you go back and look at his book, The Grand Chessboard from 1997, he says, look, it's imperative that America backs the China-Pakistan-Taliban axis in Afghanistan because we've got to keep the Iranians, the Russians, and the Indians out. And so now here we are, since 4 years later, fighting for the exact opposite ends, putting Iran's friends, the Hazaras, the Russians' friends, the Tajiks, and the Indians' friends, the Uzbeks, in power, and I guess the Tajiks too, in power in Kabul, in order to keep the Taliban, Pakistan, China axis out. So I don't know if it really matters or not, as long as it's an excuse to intervene there one way or the other. But that was the way they looked at it then as compared to now. All right, so how am I on time? Way over already, or okay?
You're good.
Okay.
Keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
You're interested? I haven't put you to sleep yet? All right.
No, we're loving it.
Okay, so Barack Obama becomes a president in 2009. Now, he ran on the idea that, and this is kind of a liberal trope, a European trope as well, that Iraq distracted us from the real good war in Afghanistan. If only Bush hadn't diverted all those resources away and we had really doubled and tripled down from the very beginning in Afghanistan, then everything would have turned out so much better. And so the solution is that now we're going to pull out of Iraq while the Iraqis were kicking us out on Bush's signature. But we're going to leave Iraq, but we're going to double down in Afghanistan because that's the war that we absolutely have to win, and we're determined to win it. So what he wasn't counting on was when he came in, David Petraeus, General Petraeus, and Stanley McChrystal, all the neoconservatives, and McCain, Lindsey Graham, Michelle Bachmann, and all those in the Senate and House, went on a full court push to get him to double, triple the war. And in fact, he did escalate from 30,000 up to 100,000 men over the course of the year 2009 under tremendous pressure from all of these forces. Now, it's not to give him an excuse. As I argued in the book, he absolutely could have stood up to them and said no, and I think he would have even done well politically to do so. But instead, he caved in and rolled over. And it wasn't just a surge of another 20,000, then another 60,000 troops. It was also, as they sold at the time, it's sort of like with the media push now to demonize Assad and try to escalate the war in Syria, or the consensus against Vladimir Putin and Russia. It was this full court media press that all of the cool insider people in media and in think tanks and in government and in national security all are into this hip new fad, coin, counterinsurgency. And that good old David Petraeus, why he won the Iraq War. You can tell because they're kicking us the hell out right now. And so because the Iraq War worked out so well in the end, they said, we've got to let Petraeus try to do it again in Afghanistan. And so that was what they did. Now, part of the argument was, and this argument still goes on, but part of the argument was, in fact, Michael Flynn, the notorious first national security advisor for Donald Trump, he was the right-hand man of Stanley McChrystal, who was the general in charge of the war, and Flynn was the head of intelligence for him. And what Flynn argued in a famous paper, actually, that he published, was that airstrikes and drone strikes and night raids, that is mere anti-insurgency. And it's basically useless, or worse, it's counterproductive. And the reason why is because, yeah, maybe you're killing some bad guys, some enemies who've attacked you before, for example, but you're also killing innocent people. And every time you do, you're driving more and more people into the insurgency against you. So ultimately, it's counterproductive. Now, his argument was, that's why we need another 100,000 troops. Because then we'll saturate the population with GIs, and then all this intelligence will come to them, and then we can really pinpoint our drone strikes and our night raids on the people who really are the enemy. Now, that part of the argument is completely ridiculous, and once they had all the soldiers on the ground, it didn't turn out that they really had any better intelligence for waging their war, and of course, even more innocent people were killed, and even more enemies were made. But he's still right about how worthless anti-insurgency is, which is really the doctrine right now. Come back to that in a second, but, well, a few minutes. But so that was the thing. This was, in fact, I even have it as a separate chapter in the book, counterinsurgency doctrine in Washington, D.C. There's this whole separate phenomenon from actually counterinsurgency doctrine in Afghanistan. In D.C., it's all just about making money and networking and getting a promotion and being seen as, in with the cool crowd. George Bush's neoconservatives like Richard Pearl and Scooter Libby, they're out of fashion. But now we have Michelle Flournoy and John Nagel and David Petraeus, and these are the brand new genius think tankers from the more Democrat-leaning think tanks. And they're the real war scientists. They're the real experts who know what to do, not like Wolfowitz and these clowns. And so then that was I don't think they ever would have called Wolfowitz a clown. But anyway, that was the idea that, well, if those guys weren't good enough for you, we will be, though, that they really knew what they were doing. And then, but of course it didn't work at all, because what happened was they escalated the Marines and the Army into the country. They found more enemies. They killed them. And then even according to General McChrystal himself, by his own insurgent math, the insurgency only grew. As McChrystal himself said, for every 1 insurgent you kill, you get 10 more. For every 2 you kill, you get 20. So how do you fight a war like that? Well, the answer was we fight it with a hand behind your back. What you do is you send the GIs to stand around on the street corners like they're street cops all day, you know, being friends with the nice people and collecting this invaluable intelligence, supposedly. And then you do the night raids and the drone strikes at night and focus on the targets more narrowly. But then, of course, that just didn't happen. They just escalated the violence everywhere. And the first test case for coin was in a little town called Marja, where they warned a lot of people to flee. And then the entire time they were there, they basically treated it like a free fire zone. Anyone who's still here must be an enemy, or else why are they still here when we told everybody to leave? So killing all kinds of innocent people. A lot of the Taliban didn't really run away at all. They just went inside, put their rifle in their closet, maybe come out at night to threaten any collaborators or people who go along. And at one point, they had the ratio up to 2 to 1 because so many people had left the town. There were 2 Marines, not 2 to 1 them, 2 to 1 our guys, for every civilian, which is far beyond the proper ratio to implement your counterinsurgency doctrine according to the coin scientists, and yet it went absolutely nowhere. And McChrystal himself admitted that Marja is a bleeding ulcer. Yeah, it's really not working, it's not going anywhere. Well, right around then, the late and really great journalist Michael Hastings put out his story, The Runaway General, in Rolling Stone magazine that cost McChrystal his job. And so Obama did something clever. And what he did was he demoted Petraeus from the head of Central Command and made him the general in charge of the Afghan war. That way, when the counterinsurgency doctrine failed and the search failed, it would be on Petraeus as well as Obama. Petraeus wouldn't be able to say that, oh, if only I was there. And so it was the offer Petraeus couldn't really refuse either. He's like, well, we're counting on you now, David. Yes, sir, sir. So he goes over there, he drops coin immediately. He kept the surge, but all it meant was an escalation of violence. And Marja, they wrapped up coin in Marja, and then they didn't even try it in Kandahar City, which was what they said there was going to be the set piece of the whole thing, was they were going to pacify Kandahar City. They didn't even try it. All they did was escalate violence all throughout the south and the east of the country and accomplish virtually nothing for it. And and then they basically withdrew, and all the places where they had set up their forward operating bases, say out in Helmand province where the Marines had gone, wherever they pulled back, the Taliban just came and took those areas over. Now they don't rule the provincial capitals because that would just get them bombed, but they rule virtually the entire countryside of about 40% of the country in the south and the east, and sometimes they say as much as 60% of the country at night, depending. Even David Petraeus himself admitted that the Taliban's advantage is that their civil and criminal court systems are much fairer and much more in tune with local values than the government that the Americans support. So in other words, the basic bottom line purpose of a state, at least supposedly, is to be the local security force. And the government that the Americans have created is simply an enemy of the people there. They don't think of it as a security force at all. And if they have a dispute with their neighbor of a civil or criminal matter, they go to the Taliban to settle it because they prefer it. And the Americans can't beat that, and that's straight out of David Petraeus' mouth himself. Right now, everybody always asks me about heroin. Heroin, heroin, heroin. It's all about the heroin, right? Well, really, most American heroin comes from Mexico. So, because we have a huge drug war there, so it's really increased their drug production a lot. So that's not the key to America's opiate abuse problem, although maybe it is, and I don't understand how, but it doesn't look like it. But here's what's funny about the heroin situation in Afghanistan. The parallel that people reach for is Vietnam and the Golden Triangle, Politics of Heroin by Alfred McCoy and all that, or, of course, Iran-Contra. And when there's even the new movie about this, American Made, with Tom Cruise, right, where he's smuggling Ronald Reagan and George Bush's cocaine into Bill Clinton's Arkansas. All right. So that's what we think of, right? What if Congress won't give CIA money they want to kill people with? They sell drugs to make up the difference, right? Or just to pay for their own expenses. new clothes and cars. But so I think thinking along those lines and those more kind of, I don't want to say conspiratorial in a dismissive way, but those kind of more like narrower covert action framework of looking at it is actually misses the forest for the trees. Because really, the entire government that the USA has created in Afghanistan is one big heroin ring. They are all, the entire economy of the entire country is dependent on heroin. It's virtually half of their gross domestic product. And every governor and every warlord of any import whatsoever is in on it, on their side and on our side. Now, the Taliban rule Helmand province, and that's where most of the heroin comes from. And so it's easy for our government to demonize the Taliban and say what drug dealers they are, and there may be some of that, but I think mostly they tax. There's a great report by Andrew Coburn in Harper's recently about how the taxation rates aren't nearly as high and the revenue amounts aren't nearly as high as previous estimates. But still, yes, the Taliban basically do run their operation. A lot of the resistance does come from heroin money, but the same thing for the government too. And so it's an overt action program. There's nothing really secret about it. It's in the New York Times that every governor in every province is dependent on this system. And a lot of this, Alfred McCoy has written a lot of really great stuff about this for Tom Dispatch, about how a lot of this is because of the Afghan wars that America helped get going starting back 40 years ago. That all their previous crops basically have fallen to the wayside. Opium and poppies are basically the knife that cuts the Gordian knot, solves all the different problems for everybody at once in terms of, well, profit margins and time frames, basically. So it's just part of the entire economy is just entirely dependent on poppies. Now the obvious solution for libertarians is, well, you just legalize it. That's what they did in Turkey, and that's what they did in India, and they still grow poppies, but they sell it all on the open market for medicinal purposes, for the pharmaceutical industry of the planet Earth, where people need painkillers every day, and so that's one strategy the Americans, of course, will never go for. They have to, even now, they're attacking the Taliban's drug infrastructure, or they're literally using F-22s and B-52s to bomb little shacks in backyards, calling them drug laboratories when they're, backyard shack drug labs, and they're using, these zillion-dollar airplanes to do it. And now, so a lot of people maybe would even concede this, or just, think any cranky old right-wing Fox News fan might agree that 16 years is a pretty long war in Afghanistan, and I'm ready to go fight somewhere else now. I don't know, something. Why do we have to stay there? And I think a real big part of that is the safe haven myth. They say that we can never leave because then Al-Qaeda will come back. Well, the thing is, the Al-Qaeda guys that escaped to Pakistan with bin Laden, about 80 of them, they're dead. And bin Laden, Barack Obama and the CIA really eliminated virtually all of the last of them with the drone war in Pakistan in his first term, and including bin Laden himself. Zawahiri is still there podcasting on a pretty regular basis. But for the most part, there really are no Al-Qaeda guys in Pakistan, and there haven't been any Al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan to fight this whole time. They've been gone. We've been fighting not international Arab terrorists, but local Pashtun militiamen. And but the threat of Al-Qaeda one day coming home is actually now been superseded. Because now, as a result of Obama's escalations on the Pakistani side of the border, a bunch of Pakistani Taliban, a separate group, the Tehrik-i Taliban, they fled from Pakistan into Afghanistan for safe haven. And after staying a while in a small part of Nangarhar province, back in 2014 or 13, they hoisted the black flag and declared themselves ISIS. It was 2014. Now, these are just, again, Pashtun militiamen. They're from Pakistan, but they're not international Al-Qaeda Arab terrorist types. They're not the ones these Iraqis and Syrians who created their mini caliphate in western Iraq and eastern Syria. They're still just local fighters, and now they include basically break-offs of the Taliban. Taliban commanders who were on the outs then switched sides to go join the Islamic State there. But so now, mythical Arab al-Qaeda fighters coming across the border, coming back from Pakistan, is no longer the excuse. Now, there are groups in Afghanistan who call themselves ISIS. And the fact that I and maybe you would want to quibble and say, yeah, but they're not really international Arab terrorists. They're just locals who have claimed the name of this famous franchise for their own purposes. And so don't let that fool you. Is a pretty, hard row to hoe. Basically, they have a huge propaganda coup in having this group call themselves ISIS. And then, of course, the more the Americans have escalated the war against them since 2014 and 15, the bigger they've got. And you might remember that Donald Trump dropped the Moab bomb, even bigger than a daisy cutter, 21,000 pounds on a tunnel complex, this fuel air bomb. And a report came out very quickly that ISIS loved it, and that their radio station in Nangarhar province was nonstop. Look at what big guys we are. Look at how important we are. The Americans brought out their biggest bomb ever, their biggest non-nuclear bomb to bear against us. And it was huge and great for recruiting, which might sound crazy, right? Who wants to get bombed by some giant bomb? But the point is they want to join up to fight those who would dare to drop such a giant bomb. And to be part of that, to defend against that. The same way Americans, we don't want to get hit in a September 11th attack, but boy, we'll try to take revenge for one. And so it's the same kind of dynamic there. And the more that we escalate the fight, I interviewed this Dutch reporter, Betta Dam, back in 2016, and she said the more we attack them, the worse the violence gets in Nangarhar, the more we demonize as the U.S. Army, Green Berets, and or I guess it's the Rangers, I'm sorry, I forget which. I guess it's the Green Berets taking it to the ISIS guys in Nangarhar. And the more we fight them, the U.S. Air Force fights them, the bigger they get, the worse the violence gets there. And she was absolutely right then. It's now 2 years later, a year and a half later, and everything has just continued to escalate more and more, with more and more attacks being blamed on ISIS every day. And so, what a boon to the war party that they can pretend that ISIS, that was a break-off of al-Qaeda in Iraq, that really America and its allies helped to seize eastern Syria and then, blew back into western Iraq as well, leading to Iraq War III, is behind what's going on in Afghanistan, when it's basically nothing but a lie. In fact, this ISIS group, I don't know if the CIA was in on this or not, but it's alleged pretty credibly that the Afghan government actually helped support this ISIS group in Nangarhar province for a time for use against the Pakistanis as a tit for tat, as revenge for their support for the Afghan Taliban on their side of the border. And so we'll show you. And then they also thought they could use them against the Afghan Taliban. And so I think they've abandoned that project since then. But in the meantime, it helped to build them up. They call them ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province, which is, back in history, is an eastern province of Iran, and that used to encompass the Persian Empire, I guess, that used to encompass parts of northern Afghanistan there. All right, so I mentioned Petraeus, basically conceding that the Taliban are from there. They have popular support where the government that we have tried to install on the people, particularly of Pashtunistan here, has not taken. Now, there's this great reporter named Anand Gopal who's written all about how the Taliban had tried to surrender in the first place, and how all these various warlords that we're fighting now had all tried to come to terms with the new government. The Taliban had not sworn that this will be the mother of all battles and we will return one day and all this. Mullah Omar, the former leader, he went home. He retired and went back to his religious studies. He was living, he died in 2013, but nobody even knew it because that's how little it mattered. We didn't find out for 2 years. He'd been sitting there reading books the whole time. Anyway, so Anand Gopal has reported on this letter. I guess it's originally Alan Collison from the Wall Street Journal, who found this letter on a hard drive in Kabul shortly after the war. Its communications is a whole treasure trove of al-Qaeda emails. and it included a letter from bin Laden to Mullah Omar that said, look, I know you're really mad right now. He's kind of sucking up to him. Says, you're doing a really great job, standing up to the Americans and everything. And I know things look really bleak right now. But trust me, in 10 years, when we see what's happened after the Americans have come and found themselves bogged down in God's holy land and with their true believers fighting at them and sniping at them from the mountains, and you'll see that I was right and that it was worth it. And so this is, right, just like Madeleine Albright. It's a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it to kill these civilians, to achieve our aims, to create this crisis so that things will get better after they're done getting worse. And of course, he was right that the Americans would play directly into his hands there. 2,400 and something American soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors have died there in the war so far. Certainly tens of thousands of Afghans, mostly civilians, nobody really knows, probably in the hundreds of thousands. There have been various studies, but it's, even according to the people who do the studies, it's virtually impossible to get good numbers in a place like Afghanistan, where many people are just beyond any kind of reach at all to know. But the U.S. has spent more money, adjusted for inflation, on the, quote, rebuilding of Afghanistan, the infrastructure projects in Afghanistan, than they spent on the entire Marshall Plan for rebuilding post-war Western Europe after World War II. And they've achieved virtually nothing whatsoever for it. Power plants that have no wires hooked to them, wires that have no power plants hooked to them, facilities that cannot be used, could never be used, were political decisions, not economic decisions when they were implemented, and so that's why they come to naught. For all the reports of building schools for little girls, it basically never happened. In some places there have been, some few advances like that, but for the most part, you're talking about building schools in places in the middle of nowhere with no electricity and no water and no transportation for the kids to get there, and thing falls apart the first time it rains, the thing dissolves and falls down, and it's just a big scam. Somebody gets to pocket some money, but nothing ever gets done of any note. And that goes for the highway system and for every bit of the infrastructure that the Americans have poured money into there the whole time. We spent over $1 trillion on a national debt that's already more than $20 trillion. According to Colonel Douglas McGregor in a recent interview on Fox News, he said the force is broken. You got to understand, our Navy and Air Force have been bombing targets nonstop since 1991. Our infantry and our, mostly our special operations forces and our infantry, our Army and Marines, they don't believe in any of these missions anymore. They know better. They have no morale whatsoever to go out on these missions when they know that they're achieving nothing. They're risking their life to achieve nothing, and he said it's a broken force. It needs a break. This is exactly what the Al-Qaeda guys were trying to achieve. And then, of course, various versions of the Afghan war have played out across the entire Middle East, doubling and tripling and cubing and squaring everything I just said, across the region in terms of money spent, people killed, governments and populations destabilized and radicalized, and the rest. And they even got a caliphate for a little while in eastern Syria and western Iraq for 3 years as a direct result of America and our allies' policy in Syria, as I mentioned. And then there's backdraft. So if blowback is the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies that blow up in your face and then leave you wondering what exactly happened, susceptible to false explanations, then backdraft is the immediate result of obvious, well-known foreign policies that blow up right in your face. And so, for example, the war in Afghanistan. In recent years, Nidal Hassan of the Fort Hood attack, the Tsarnaev brothers who bombed the Boston Marathon, Omar Mateen, who perpetrated the slaughter in the nightclub in Orlando, Florida, Najibullah Zazi, who had a plot. He was fortunately intercepted by the FBI, and this was not a fake entrapment job by the FBI. This was one of the actual ones. plot to bomb the subways in New York. Faisal, that was supposed to be a joke, it's not. Faisal Shahzad, who tried to bomb Times Square in 2010. Ahmed Rahami, who did, you might remember, I guess a year and a half, 2 years ago, tried to bomb the sidewalks in a town in New Jersey and in New York. Luckily didn't hurt anyone. And then just last June, a guy named Fatui did an attack with a knife at an airport in Michigan. He was a Canadian, and he attacked a cop with a knife and tried to take his gun, and then presumably would have done a lot more damage than that. All of these men have invoked America's war in Afghanistan as part of their motivation for attacking the United States. Now, if that plane really did just come out of the clear blue sky, and if they started it in '01 and they only hate us because we're virtuous and innocent and wonderful, and if there's some consequences of these low-level type terrorist attacks, not to call, Fort Hood or Orlando low level, but in the scheme of things, if that's the consequences of the American people defending ourselves the very best way that we know how and can do, then tough, I guess. But that's not it, right? Because America actually did start it in the first place. And they told our soldiers and Marines that the reason that you're going to fight this war over there is to fight them over there so that we don't have to fight them over here. And Thomas Gibbons Neff, who's a Marine and an Afghan war vet who writes for the Washington Post, wrote a piece that said that when I was over in Afghanistan, it was terrible over there, fighting. But I told myself that, well, I'm attracting these people to me, and they're fighting me here, and so I'm doing the brave thing, standing guard and keeping them off of my family back home, keeping my family back home safe. But wait, if my mission in Afghanistan is what's motivating attacks back home, I think he was writing after the Boston attack, he said, then what exactly is my mission? If my war to prevent the attacks is what's causing them? And how can we continue to ask American soldiers and Marines to keep fighting on these missions, killing people and risking their own lives, if it's simply counterproductive? Not just insurgent math in Afghanistan on the ground, but insurgent math in terms of creating more terrorist attacks for the American people here. And this, of course, then leads to what Osama bin Laden called the choking life. He didn't hate our freedom. He wasn't jealous of our freedom. He knew that we were jealous of our freedom, or he was betting that we were. And the idea was that, as he put it, he would create this choking life where our government would create a security state, a police state, in order to protect us from the threat of terrorism, which undermines their authority. If terrorists can continually get away with terrorist attacks, it reduces confidence in government, so they're terrified of that. All secret and cynical agendas aside, they must clamp down. And so then that puts us in the situation of resenting the fake security theater at the airports. Well, it's very real, the security theater that they make us go through at the airports. The warrantless searches and wiretapping of all of our electronic communication, all of our financial lives without any kind of warrants whatsoever. And for that matter, the outright legalization of torture and murder and the militarization of our police to the nth degree, and all these things that are a direct result, and the creation of the Homeland Security State, which is itself rivals the military-industrial complex and the national security state that we already have in terms of the sheer numbers of companies and the sheer amount of money being spent on this racket, and that many special interests being motivated and incentivized to perpetuate this system. And so at some point, bin Laden was betting that we would buck, and we would then say to our government, listen, if giving up our Bill of Rights is the price of dominating the Middle East, then why would we do that? Which would be the right calculation, and that's why they have to twist it, and that's why they have to say, well, we're giving up our Bill of Rights, even though that's supposedly what we're fighting for here when they say they hate us for how free we are. We have to give it up, not to appease them, but just because it gets in the way of us protecting you well. And so you have to give it up, and you have to let them get away with bloody murder. And so I'm not saying that then, so we should give in to Al-Qaeda and Osama's ghost here. I'm not saying that we should appease terrorists and do what they say, but I'm saying that we should stop doing the wrong thing because it's the right thing to stop doing the wrong thing. And it's the wrong thing that's put us in this situation, created these enemies for us, and created this situation that threatens our freedom so much. In fact, since you guys are libertarians, let me throw in a little bit of economics here too, because one thing that we all care a lot about, I hope all of you care and know a little about, care about, is the Austrian school explanation of the business cycle. And I like to try to tell people, because my show's not really for libertarians, it's for everybody. So I try to tell people, listen, if you're a conservative, or if you're a socialist, or a leftist, or a liberal, or progressive, or black, white, town, country, farmer, or factory, or I don't care what your identity is, you can keep it. I'm not trying to change you into a libertarian on everything, but you gotta understand, the Austrian school are the ones who can explain, who are the only ones who have the true explanation of why we go through these repetitive cycles of these periods of seeming prosperity that then appear to, are revealed then to be very hollow, and actually then we have these very real busts and recessions and depressions every 10 or 12 years or so. This boom and this bust. And of course the Austrian explanation is it's because the central bank, the police power, gives license to banks to expand bank credit. In other words, to expand the amount of money, the monetary base in the society. And in doing that, it doesn't just create rising prices across the board. It creates rising prices in some sectors of the market, like housing or .coms or other things, just the stock market overall, that end up then necessitating these major corrections. And so much of this is because of the warfare state. When Bush took power, he said, hey, it's the Clinton recession, I just got here. Remember that? And he was right. And he was making sure to brand it that so that you wouldn't blame it on him. It was a little bit of a slow and a sluggish time because of the coming down, the crashing of the dot-com bubbles. Now, the Federal Reserve was still expanding bank credit and expanding the housing bubble, but the recession had hit. And then September 11th hit. And September 11th hit, first of all, two of the major airlines themselves, but really the entire airline industry. And then the targets were in the financial district in downtown Manhattan. So this was sure to make the depression, the recession worse. But so then what happened was Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates virtually to zero. And they put the pedal all the way to the floor. And they did so that George Bush could not just attack Afghanistan, but could wage the larger war on terrorism, including invading and occupying Iraq, and make it seem free. Remember, they even sent out rebate checks in the mail 2 years in a row, $200 and $300. Everybody gets $300. Like this is your dividend check from the profit, from all the money that we're all making off of the Iraq war, when in fact we're blowing trillions and trillions of dollars. And they do this, they inflate the money supply so that later on, when you're staring at your shoes on the unemployment line, you're paying your price for the Iraq war there. But you don't realize how it was that wealth was extracted from you. And so that's the way that works. It's a huge part of the economic disruption in this society, which then, of course, you can ask the Federal Reserve because they keep track of this very closely. This is, amounts to everything. This is the root of the suicide rate, of the divorce rate, of the bankruptcy rate, of the foster home rate, of the health of society with this boom and this bust. And this is what they continually put us through. And it's in order to make the world empire seem free, when in fact it costs us a cool $1 trillion a year, every year, to keep this empire going. And so that's a huge part of all of the rest of the disruption and division in our society comes back to that. All right, so now real quick about Trump, and I'll let y'all go. Donald Trump knows better than this. Our current president of the United States. Can you believe Donald Trump is the president of the United States? Anyway, it cracks me up every morning. I just think about that. It's so funny.
Simpsons were right 22 years ago, yeah.
But so he spent like 5-6 years attacking Obama over Afghanistan. Which doesn't sound that unique, right? Because all the Republicans attacked Obama over Afghanistan, as we talked about. But Trump didn't attack him for not doing enough. Trump didn't attack him for dithering. Trump attacked him for escalating the war. So this is stupid. You're wasting money. Our bridges are falling down. We need that money at home to make America great again. And we know Trump really hated Obama. But when it was time for the surge to begin to end and the troop numbers to be drawn down, Obama stuck with it. And he told Petraeus, you gave me your word. That's it. We're bringing the troops home right now. Well, most of them, not all of them. He broke that promise. But he did bring down from the height of the surge numbers. And the generals started to buck again and started to say Obama's doing the wrong thing. We got to keep the troops there longer. And Donald Trump, who hated Obama more than anybody hated Obama, took Obama's side and said the generals are wrong. They need to listen to the commander-in-chief. It's time to bring the troops home from Afghanistan. This war is a horrible waste. So I'm not saying he read a bunch of books about it, or he really knows a lot about it, or he cares about Afghanistan itself at all. But here's a guy who can sit around and watch Fox News and say, this thing has gone on too long. I'm sick and tired of it. I don't see the good of it. Maybe he doesn't know what a Pashtun is, but he does know that the job basically is to pacify the local population, like the British and the Soviets and Alexander the Great had tried to do. That's a quote of Donald Trump. That, well, Alexander couldn't do it and the British couldn't do it, why could we do it? Which goes to show that he can differentiate between international Arab terrorists and local Pashtun tribesmen. Again, even if he doesn't know the name, he knows that's who we're fighting over there, and it's not worth doing. And yet when he came into power, they immediately gave him the Obama treatment. And the first thing that happened was the general in charge of the Afghan war, General Nicholson, went and testified before John McCain's Armed Services Committee and said we need at least 3,000 or 5,000 more troops soon. And I don't know exactly what happened here, but it looks to me like that really angered Trump, that they were trying to sandbag him and corner him like that. And so even though I had word from some really good Pentagon reporters that they were going to announce the escalation as early as in March before last, as soon as he came into power, almost 6 weeks after coming into office, they kept kicking the can down the road. They said, well, we're going to announce the escalation before we go to the NATO meeting in May. And they said, okay, well, we're going to announce it when we get back from the NATO meeting in May. And they said, well, we're going to announce it in the middle of July. And then it wasn't until almost the end of August 21st, that Trump finally gave in. I think Stephen Bannon was helping Trump to fend off Mattis and McMaster on this. That's General James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and General H.R. McMaster, who was the National Security Advisor, the second one. And so once Bannon was out of the way, they literally dragged Trump to Camp David, and you can see the pictures of this, where it's Trump and like 10 generals, and then some CIA and all national security officials, and they just basically dragged him out to the woods and read him the riot act and told him this is what you're going to do, and he clicked his heels and said, sir, yes, sir, and ordered their escalation. Signed on their dotted line and ordered, another 3,000 to 5,000 troops to go and escalate the war. And it was really McMaster's plan. And McMaster himself and his people had leaked to the media and said to the media that, well, the plan is to just keep fighting. David Petraeus had told Obama, give me 18 months and I'll bring the Taliban to the table and I'll make them sign on our terms. Well, McMaster didn't say 18 months. McMaster said, you know what? Maybe at the end of this next 4-year cycle of fighting, we will be in a stronger position and a better position to negotiate with the Taliban. After another 4 years of going nowhere on this thing, and with a tenth of the men that Obama had in the country in 2011 and 12, and with no hope, no prayer of making any so-called progress whatsoever. And so just 2 stories from the last week. The first one was that in the last year they have increased the air campaign in Afghanistan to levels not seen since 2011, to the height of the war. And they're just like Michael Flynn would tell you, they don't have the intelligence on the ground to pick these targets. And so they're just basically firing blind in the name, again, of the drug war, calling out B-52 carpet bombers for little drug labs in private backyards, claiming that this is going to disrupt the Taliban once and for all, and this kind of thing. And then, in fact, in the Military Times article where they talk about this, they say, well, of course, see, we need more infantry so that we can have that better intelligence we need. And so that's all they can think of to do is just to double and escalate the war again, and go right back to the war again. So, but now McMaster's gone, and Trump, say a lot of things about him. I got a lot of things to say about him. I'm sure y'all do. But part of his whole shtick basically is that he's not a senator and he's not a governor. He's not one of them. Not really. And so he's a right-wing nationalist, a general worshiper, who always wants to strike a tough stance. He's really staked out, I think, a position that he's no longer wants to overthrow secular governments in a Bush and Obama fashion, like they did in Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and halfway in Syria there. But he did always say that we're going to knock the hell out of ISIS, or then that includes Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, the Haqqanis, Al-Shabaab, and whatever you got. Wherever there's a Sunni with a rifle, our military, our CIA will frame that as an associated force with Al-Qaeda and close enough to fight. So it seems like, based on that prescription, then that means we'll stay. In fact, Dina Powell, who was the assistant national security advisor under Flynn in the book Fire and Fury, this was a believable quote, not the whole book, but I thought that this was a pretty reasonable to believe quote. She said that, look, you know what, at the end of the day, if we pull all the troops out of Afghanistan, then that's Trump losing a war, and Trump can't lose a war. And so it's just politics, just domestic DC politics, just like Lyndon Johnson on the phone, on the recorded call, saying, I won't be the first president to lose a war. I know I can't win it, but that's going to have to be somebody else's problem. Same thing Bush said about Iraq War II. Other presidents will have to figure out how this ends. And yet, that's really not right. I mean, that actually makes perfect sense if you're a Democratic or a Republican pollster type, expert pundit who would be interviewed on CNN or something like that. But that's not really right at all. He's Donald Trump. He could get right up there, even after a year of this, even after 2 years of this. What the hell? He could get up there and say, you know what, this is all that dummy George Bush and that wimp Barack Obama's fault, not mine. And they created a situation that is just too costly in terms of lives and treasure to try to tie up these loose ends and fix it. They built a government in Kabul that still can't stand without us paying it billions of dollars a year to keep it afloat. Their army would fall apart the day after ours leaves. And so if they've created this big unsustainable project, I'm a businessman and I know that what you're supposed to do is walk away from unsustainable projects and do something else instead. And so if you don't like it, take it up with Bush and Obama, and that's it. And politically speaking, the American people would agree with that move anyway. The Washington, D.C. consensus might scream that from now on, anything bad that happens in Afghanistan is Trump's fault for pulling the troops out. But the American people wouldn't care about that, wouldn't hold it against him whatsoever. The American people have been against the war by pretty good majority since at least 2013. This just hasn't been a high enough priority. But if he went with his own thinking on the issue and just said, forget this, man, I don't want to, I don't know if the American people would throw a parade and call him Trump the Great, but there's certainly no way that they would hold it against him. And I think he's in the perfect position. I mean, Hillary Clinton, what's she going to do? Blame it on Bill and George, her best, her husband and her best friend, and all the policy that she supported this whole time. So he's in a unique position to do it if he had the wisdom, if he had the political wherewithal to realize that this could benefit him. To do it that way, I think he could, and I think certainly the Afghans and the American people would all be better for it. So, okay, that's enough. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.